Get comfortable, settle in, because what we are about to go through is not a recap, not a summary, not a countdown. This is a slow walk through the most unsettling corners of the Resident Evil universe, the theories that live in the footnotes of files no one reads on the first playthrough, the questions that researchers, forum dwellers, and lore obsessives have been arguing about for nearly 30 years. Some of what you are about to hear is confirmed canon. Some of it is documented speculation from the fanbase. Some of it is the kind of pattern recognition that only happens when you have stared at this franchise long enough that it starts staring back. We are going to go through 135 of them, slowly, with the kind of detail they deserve. So dim the lights, pull the blanket up, and let us begin at the very beginning. Not 1998, not Spencer Mansion, long before all of that. Long before the corporation, before the virus, before the city burning in the dark. We start somewhere ancient. Section 1. The Ancient Ones. Progenitor, the Nindipaya, and what was there first? Theory 1. The progenitor virus is millions of years old and was never meant to be found. Deep in the highlands of West Africa, in a region so remote it appeared on almost no colonial-era map, a civilization called the Ndipaya built something extraordinary. Not a city in the conventional sense, not a trading empire, not a military power. What they built was a relationship with a flower, a single species of plant that bloomed only once every few years, in narrow crevices of rock where sunlight hit at specific angles, fed by mineral-rich groundwater that ran through the mountainside. The Ndipaya called it the stairway to the sun. They did not consume it carelessly. They did not experiment with it as a resource. They built their entire culture around protecting it, understanding it, and worshiping what it could do. What it could do was change people at a genetic level. Consuming the flower's nectar introduced something into the bloodstream that the Ndipaya recognized as a kind of trial. Warriors who survived the contact emerged changed, stronger, faster, with accelerated healing that could close wounds that should have been fatal within hours. Those who could not survive the exposure simply died. The Ndipaya had no scientific framework for understanding this. They had a religious one. The flower selected the worthy. Those who lived were elevated. Those who died were not chosen. What the Ndipaya had discovered, without any terminology to describe it, was the progenitor virus. An organism so ancient that the scientific consensus within the Resident Evil universe places its origin at millions of years before human civilization. Not thousands, millions. This was not something that appeared alongside humanity. It was here before us. Long before our species developed complex thought, this organism was already embedded in the ecosystem of that specific region of West Africa, locked into the biology of one flowering plant that grew nowhere else on Earth. The theory that unsettles people is not the virus itself. It is what the virus suggests about the relationship between biological complexity and time. Something that can rewrite human genetics at a cellular level, that can select for specific traits and enhance them to superhuman degrees, that existed for millions of years in a corner of Africa waiting. The Ndipaya found it. They kept it secret for generations. The region where it grew eventually became a site of ruins, the Sun Garden, a fortress that the Ndipaya used to protect the flower. Outsiders who entered the region with hostile intent encountered warriors enhanced by the virus and did not come back. The flower would not be found by the outside world until the 1960s, when Oswell Spencer, James Marcus, and Edward Ashford followed a trail of rumors, historical accounts, and botanical anomalies to the highlands of West Africa. When Spencer encountered the Ndipaya culture and the progenitor virus, he did not see a sacred relationship between a people and their land. He saw a mechanism for forcing human evolution. He saw the foundation of an empire. The Ndipaya civilization was destroyed to control access to the flower. Spencer funded what amounted to a sustained campaign of displacement and violence against the descendants of the people who had lived with and protected the progenitor virus for generations. By the time Umbrella was formally established in 1968, the Ndipaya were gone from the region, and the Sun Garden was in Spencer's possession. The theory many fans hold is that the destruction of the Ndipaya was not incidental. It was the first planned atrocity in Resident Evil's long chain of institutional crimes, and Spencer never acknowledged it as a crime at all. From his perspective, he had simply acquired a resource. The people who had been caring for that resource for centuries were obstacles, not victims. This framing, resources versus people, would define Umbrella Corporation from its first day of operation. Theory 2. The progenitor virus may have influenced human evolution long before the Ndipaya. If the virus is genuinely millions of years old, and if its natural vector is a flower that evolved in one specific geographic region, then how many times over the course of human prehistory did early hominids or archaic humans consume it accidentally? The sun garden was accessible if you knew where to look. The flower was physically present for millions of years. Something about the ecological relationship between that plant and its environment kept the virus viable across geological time. That is not normal for any known organism. Some fans theorize that the unusual resilience of certain Resident Evil characters who have no known viral exposure might trace back to ancient genetic contact with the progenitor virus somewhere in their ancestry. The way certain people survive things they should not survive. The way certain bodies seem to accept viral exposure with fewer complications than the statistical baseline would predict. The game never confirms this, but the virus's age means the question is not irrational. Theory 3. Edward Ashford was deliberately kept away from the primary progenitor samples. Spencer and Ashford were co-founders of Umbrella. They shared the same basic ideological vision in the beginning. Eugenics, directed evolution, a new humanity built from viral technology. But Ashford was also a scientist who cared about the research itself, not just the political application. He wanted to understand the virus. Spencer wanted to use it. There are accounts suggesting that Spencer systematically limited Ashford's access to the most potent progenitor samples while feeding him diluted research data. Ashford developed the T-virus alongside Marcus and Birkin, but he never had the full picture of what Spencer was doing with the purest strains. When Ashford died of exposure to an early T-virus variant, some researchers believe this was less an accident of research, and more the predictable outcome of a man working with incomplete information about the organism he was studying. Spencer had the complete safety protocols. Ashford, working from partial data, made a mistake that killed him. Whether Spencer engineered this outcome or simply allowed it to happen is a distinction the canon never clearly resolves. But by the time Ashford died, Spencer was the last of the three original founders with his hands on the operational direction of Umbrella. That is the only outcome the sequence of events consistently points toward. Theory 4. The Ndipaya legend about the stairway to the sun was not metaphor. It was warning. The Ndipaya mythology around the flower described a journey. Those who consumed it and survived ascended. Those who died fell. Most interpretations of this legend frame it as a description of the viral selection process. The worthy survive and become stronger. But some lore analysts have noted that the metaphor of ascension cuts both ways. Going up means you are moving away from where you started. You are not the same thing you were. The people who consumed the progenitor virus and survived did not remain who they had been. They became something else. The Ndipaya's ritual framework around this was not celebratory. It was careful, considered. They understood that the change the virus produced came with something sacrificed. The warriors who were enhanced were no longer ordinary members of their community. They were elevated, yes, but also separated. The word stairway implies ongoing motion. You are always in the process of moving away from the human baseline. You never quite stop. Spencer read this as an invitation. The Ndipaya may have intended it as a caution. Theory 5. James Marcus was the most genuinely brilliant scientist in Umbrella's history, and Spencer destroyed him for it. Marcus was the third founder. He operated the management training facility, one of the first serious research installations Umbrella built. His focus was the T-virus, and his approach to developing it was methodical, thorough, and built on genuine understanding of the organism. His research notes, available in Resident Evil 0, show a man who was deeply engaged with the biology of what he was working on. Who asked questions about mechanism, not just outcome. Who was troubled by what he was producing even as he continued producing it. His signature discovery, the interaction between leeches and the progenitor strain, produced what would become the foundation of the T-virus project. The queen leech's ability to absorb and modify viral DNA was a biological phenomenon Marcus documented with extraordinary precision. He was not just good at his job. He was among the best virologists the franchise ever depicts. Spencer had him assassinated in 1988. using Wesker and Birkin as the instruments of that assassination. The official framing was that Marcus had become a threat to Umbrella's stability. The actual reason was simpler. Marcus was getting close to understanding things Spencer did not want understood. He was asking questions about the broader implications of the research that Spencer had no interest in answering. A scientist that good, with that much curiosity and that much access, was a liability to a man who needed complete control of the information. So, Spencer had him killed, then had Wesker and Birkin steal his research, carry it forward, and receive credit for advances that originated in Marcus's work. When Marcus returned as a Queen Leech composite in Resident Evil 0, it was not a supernatural resurrection. It was a biological one. The Leech colony had absorbed enough of his DNA and neural patterns to reconstruct a version of him from the cellular blueprint he had left behind. The same principle the Megamycete would later apply to Ethan Winters in Louisiana. Marcus got the last word, in a way. The T-virus outbreak in the Arklay Mountains in 1998 that started the entire chain of events leading to Raccoon City was caused by him, or rather, by what the Leeches had become after decades of absorbing his grief and his anger. Spencer's assassination attempt created the conditions for his own undoing. After that first section, I want to pause for just a moment and say, if you are watching this at whatever hour it is where you are, whether it is 2 in the morning on a Tuesday or a lazy Sunday with rain on the windows, go ahead and drop a comment with where you are and what time it is. I genuinely love knowing who is out there listening to this with me. And if you are new here and you find yourself wanting more of this kind of slow deep dive into game lore, a subscription means a lot more of this comes your way. Now, back into the dark. Theory 6. The T-virus was never intended to create zombies. Zombies were a failed byproduct. This one bothers people when they hear it because the entire franchise is built on the image of the shambling undead. But if you actually read the research documents available throughout the series, Umbrella's stated goal was never the creation of reanimated corpses. The T-virus project was oriented toward bioorganic weaponry of a specific kind. Enhanced soldiers. Controlled mutations that would produce physically superior combatants who could follow orders, survive battlefield conditions no normal human could endure, and be manufactured from existing biological templates. Zombies were what happened when the virus was deployed in an uncontrolled environment on subjects who were genetically incompatible with the enhancement pathway. The virus rewrote their cells, but destroyed the higher brain function in the process. What remained was biological motion driven entirely by stem brain activity, the hunger, the aggression, the directional responses to stimuli, all the automated processes of the body still running without the software of personhood to direct them. Birkin understood this. His frustration with the T-virus, documented across multiple files, was precisely that the intelligent BOW branch of the research kept producing failures at the higher cognitive function stage. Something in the mutation process consistently obliterated the complex reasoning capacity that made a super soldier useful. You ended up with something that was hard to kill but impossible to command, a weapon with no off switch and no targeting system. This is why Birkin pivoted so heavily to the G-virus. He believed Golgotha had solved the core problem that the T-virus never could. He was partly right and catastrophically wrong about how wrong the other part was. Theory 7. Chief Brian Irons of the Raccoon City Police Department knew the outbreak was coming months before it happened. Irons was on Umbrella's payroll. This is documented and confirmed within the game's own files. He received payments from Umbrella in exchange for suppressing investigations into suspicious activity in and around Raccoon City, burying reports about the unusual deaths in the Arklay Mountains, and ensuring that the Raccoon City Police Department remained focused on conventional crime rather than the increasingly anomalous incidents accumulating at the edges of the city. What is less discussed is what this means about Irons' awareness of the scope of what was coming. Umbrella did not pay him generously enough to suppress the entire Raccoon City outbreak on his own. At some point, the situation became uncontrollable. Irons knew something was wrong at the Arklay laboratory months before the first zombie appeared in the streets. He received reports. He buried them. He took the money. The theory is that Irons spent the months between his awareness of the emerging crisis and the actual outbreak quietly preparing for personal survival. His obsessive collection of taxidermy, his elaborate hidden spaces in the police station, his apparent stockpiling of resources. Some fans interpret his behavior not as the eccentricity of a corrupt official, but as the methodical preparation of a man who knew the city was going to collapse and was making sure he had somewhere to ride it out. He was wrong about being able to ride it out. But the preparation suggests foreknowledge that went beyond what his official relationship with Umbrella would have required. Section 2. Umbrella's Rotten Foundation Theory. 8. Umbrella was profitable as a pharmaceutical company. The bioweapons division was never necessary for the corporation's financial survival. This is one of those theories that seems boring until you follow it to its conclusion. Umbrella Corporation produced real products: cosmetics, medications, medical devices. These were not cover operations with no actual market presence. The pharmaceutical wing generated genuine revenue at a scale that would have sustained the company indefinitely without any investment in bioweapons research. So, why the bioweapons? Spencer's stated rationale was funding. Umbrella needed money to pursue the progenitor virus research, which required expensive facilities, specialized equipment, and the kind of deep financial insulation that kept governments and regulatory bodies from looking too closely at what was happening in the mountain laboratories. Bioweapons contracts provided that insulation. When you sell weapons to governments, governments become motivated to ensure your continued operation. But the numbers never quite added up as a pure business decision. The bioweapons research cost enormously more than it generated. The research failures alone, the Raccoon City disaster being only the most visible example, produced financial liabilities that eventually destroyed the company. If Spencer's actual goal was sustaining a research program into human evolution, he could have structured Umbrella as a pure pharmaceutical corporation with a hidden research wing funded by legitimate profits. The theory is that Spencer wanted the bioweapons for their own sake, not because they were profitable, not because they were instrumentally necessary, because creating controllable organisms that could be deployed against populations was itself part of the plan. You cannot remake humanity through voluntary adoption of your ideology. You need mechanisms of enforcement. You need the ability to threaten. The bioweapons were not a funding mechanism. They were the future governance model, already in development. Theory 9. The Raccoon City location was chosen deliberately. Raccoon City sits in the Arklay Mountains. Spencer owned the mansion at the heart of the mountain laboratory complex. When Umbrella chose to establish a major research installation, and eventually the nest facility beneath Raccoon City itself, the location was not selected for logistical convenience. The Arklay region was chosen because Spencer already owned land there. The mountains provided natural containment. The proximity to a mid-sized American city provided a ready population of test subjects that were just close enough to the research to be useful in a crisis, but just far enough that ordinary citizens had no reason to connect their city to the laboratory complex in the mountains above it. Raccoon City's population was approximately 100,000 people, a contained, manageable number for crisis response if something went wrong, large enough to generate meaningful data in a real-world outbreak scenario, small enough that its destruction could be contained within a single military operation. Some fans argue that Raccoon City was always intended to be expendable in the long run, a test environment that could be sterilized if necessary. The government's willingness to bomb the city in October 1998 suggests a contingency framework that had existed for some time. Those kinds of decisions do not get made in hours. The protocol for destroying a city has to be planned well in advance. Theory 10. Spencer infected himself with the progenitor virus, and it did not work. This one comes directly from the canon. Spencer attempted viral self-enhancement. He wanted to be one of the superhuman beings he was engineering. He wanted to be part of the new world he was building, not just its architect. The progenitor virus rejected him. No enhancement occurred. He remained simply an old man with an increasingly frail body and an ideology that had consumed everything around it. The psychological implications are significant and rarely discussed. Spencer spent his entire adult life believing that genetic superiority was real, measurable, and producible through viral intervention. He selected hundreds of children based on genetics and intelligence, raised them, educated them, and infected them precisely because he believed some of them carried the biological potential for transcendence. Albert Wesker survived. Albert Wesker became superhuman. Spencer did not. The virus looked at Oswell Spencer, founder of Umbrella Corporation, architect of Project W, orchestrator of the Raccoon City disaster, and decided he was not compatible. The man who spent decades selecting for worthy candidates was not himself one of them. By the time Wesker killed him in 2006, Spencer was a frail, wheelchair-bound old man whose ambition had outlasted his biology. He had spent his life engineering a better version of humanity that did not include him. Theory 11. Umbrella had subsidiaries operating in countries with no bioweapons regulations, specifically to perform experiments illegal everywhere else. The main Umbrella facilities in the United States and Europe were constrained, even if insufficiently, by the kinds of oversight that came with operating in countries with functioning regulatory bodies. But Umbrella had facilities in regions where corporate power and government corruption made oversight effectively non-existent. Facilities in South America, West Africa, certain parts of Asia. The experiments conducted in those locations were the ones where the casualty rates would have generated criminal investigations in Raccoon City. This explains why certain OW types appear in games set outside the core Raccoon City environment, with evolutionary complexity that suggests longer development timelines than the American facilities could account for. Something was being developed in parallel, in places where the failures could be buried quietly, far from any journalist or regulatory body with the authority to ask questions. Theory 12. Sergei Vladimir was loyal to Spencer personally, not to Umbrella as an institution. Sergei Vladimir, the Russian colonel who commanded the Umbrella Security Service in the final stages of the Raccoon City disaster, is one of those characters the franchise introduces briefly and never fully develops. He was one of Spencer's most trusted lieutenants. He possessed a unique genetic profile that made him exceptionally compatible with T-virus derivatives, and he had undergone personal enhancement procedures that made him physically formidable beyond anything the standard military training would produce. The theory is that Sergei did not believe in Umbrella Corporation. He believed in Spencer. When Spencer told him that the corporation's mission was the betterment of humanity through science, Sergei took that at face value, not because he was naive, but because his loyalty was to the person making the argument rather than the argument itself. He would have followed Spencer into any moral territory Spencer chose to enter. This created a bodyguard whose usefulness was contingent on Spencer remaining coherent and present. When Spencer went into hiding after Umbrella's collapse, when the corporation ceased to function as an institution, Sergei lost the figure around whom his loyalty was organized. The Umbrella Chronicles' final encounter with Sergei shows a man whose identity had become completely dependent on an institutional framework that no longer existed. His madness in those final moments was not random. It was the psychological disintegration of a person whose entire sense of purpose had been externally structured and then removed. Theory 13. The famous line, "Master of Unlocking," was not bad writing. It was Wesker deliberately condescending to his team. This one lives in a space between lore analysis and character psychology, but bear with it, because it says something real about how Wesker operated. When he hands Jill the lockpick at the beginning of Resident Evil 1 and tells her she is the master of unlocking, the phrasing is so awkward it has become legendary for being bad dialogue. But Wesker knew exactly what he was doing in that mansion. He was managing a team he fully intended to sacrifice to the bioweapons inside it. His performance as their captain required enough genuine leadership to keep them operational while he positioned them for maximum data collection before their deaths. The awkward phrasing, the slightly off-register social interaction, these were features of a man who was not actually invested in any authentic relationship with the people around him. He could mimic leadership. He could mimic camaraderie, but he could not quite mimic warmth, because warmth requires caring about the other person, and Wesker simply did not. The dialogue is not bad writing. It is a precise portrait of a sociopath doing a decent but not perfect impression of a normal human interaction. Section 3. The Children They Stole. Project W. Theory 14. Project W involved hundreds of children, but Spencer only ever intended 2 to survive to the final stage. The first phase of Project W produced hundreds of children. They were selected based on their parents' genetic profiles and intellectual contributions. They were taken, not always with consent from anyone who could meaningfully give it, and raised in funded educational environments that gave them access to the best resources available while subtly shaping their values towards Spencer's worldview. They were the crop from which Spencer intended to harvest his superhuman successors, but the math of Project W never supported hundreds of survivals. The progenitor virus strain prepared for the final infection phase had a catastrophically high fatality rate. Spencer knew this. He had been working with progenitor variants for decades. He understood that the survival probability was not something that could be reliably improved beyond a very small window. The theory is that Spencer always expected most of the children to die. The hundreds were not the intended outcome. They were the pool from which 2, maybe 3 viable candidates might emerge. Spencer was running a numbers operation. Invest enough biological capital at the input end, and something useful comes out the other side. The 11 who died when the final viral strain was administered were not tragic miscalculations. They were always the expected failure rate. Spencer's eugenics project was, at its core, a kind of brutal lottery run on stolen children. Theory 15. Albert Wesker never knew his real name. Wesker is confirmed to have been taken from his biological parents as a child and raised in a Spencer Foundation home with the surname Wesker, given to him as a label rather than inherited family identity. His original birth name is never mentioned in any document recovered from the Umbrella archives or any other source in the franchise's lore. Think about what that means psychologically for a moment. Wesker's sense of identity was constructed entirely within a system designed to shape him toward a specific end. The name he answered to was not his own. The values he held were instilled by people who viewed him as a resource. His entire self-concept was, from the beginning, a product of Spencer's project. When he later expressed contempt for ordinary humans and positioned himself as a being of superior evolution, this was not self-discovery. This was the successful deployment of an ideological program that Spencer ran on him for the first 17 years of his life. The tragedy, and it is a tragedy even for a character as genuinely monstrous as Wesker, is that his sense of exceptional personal destiny was constructed by the same man he ultimately killed. His conviction that he was a superior being was Spencer's most successful long-term experiment. Wesker believed he was transcendent. He was a product. Theory 16. Alex Wesker's T-Phobos project was Spencer's backup plan, and Spencer knew Albert would fail. Alex Wesker, who serves as the central antagonist of Resident Evil Revelations 2, pursued a fundamentally different path than Albert after Project W's conclusion. Where Albert tried to remake humanity through viral apocalypse, Alex tried to transfer her own consciousness into a new body, escaping a degenerative disease and achieving personal immortality. She developed the T-Phobos virus, a strain that activated lethally in subjects who experienced fear, and used it as the mechanism for selecting a suitable new host. The theory is that Spencer knew Albert's Ouroboros plan was going to fail. He understood Albert well enough to predict that his ambitions would outpace his execution. Albert was brilliant but brittle. He needed things to go precisely as planned. When they did not, when Chris Redfield and Sheva Alomar proved more resilient than the plan accounted for, Albert's response was escalation rather than adaptation. Spencer may have structured Project W with the assumption that Albert would eliminate himself through overreach. Alex, working separately on a longer timeline with a more contained goal, was the quiet continuation. If Albert burned everything down trying to become a god and failed, Alex would still be out there, working toward a different but related outcome: personal immortality through mind transfer rather than species-wide viral selection. The same eugenics dream expressed through individual persistence rather than mass extinction. Theory 17. The other Wesker children who survived the first phase but not the final stage are unaccounted for. The numbers here are genuinely unsettling when you work through them carefully. Project W started with hundreds of children. The first viral testing phase reduced that number significantly. By 1998, 13 candidates were identified as sufficiently promising for the final progenitor strain. 11 of those 13 died. Albert and Alex survived, but the question the franchise never fully answers is what happened to the children who passed the first phase but were not included in the final 13. They were genetically selected. They were educated and indoctrinated. They had low-level viral exposure from the early screening tests. They were adults in 1998. They were somewhere. The theory is that some of them survived the collapse of Umbrella and continued operating in the world with partial viral modification, shaped values, and no institutional context to operate within. The franchise gestures toward this with Jake Muller, who has Wesker's blood and its immunological benefits without having gone through the final Project W infection. Jake is what a partial Wesker candidate looks like: exceptional, but not superhuman, carrying genetic potential without the full viral activation. Are there others like Jake out there? People who carry enough of the modified genetics to be unusual without being fully enhanced? The canon has never definitively closed that door. Section 4. The man behind the sunglasses, Theory 18. Wesker's sunglasses were not cosmetic. They were functional. After his injection with the experimental T-virus variant and his death and revival at the Tyrant's hands in Spencer Mansion, Wesker's visual system underwent modifications. The viral enhancement that granted him superhuman speed, strength, and regenerative capacity also altered how his eyes processed light. The red-tinted glow that appears in his eyes under certain lighting conditions in later appearances is not an aesthetic choice by Capcom. Within the lore, his enhanced eyes were more light-sensitive than human eyes and processed visual information at a faster rate than normal human neurology could manage. The sunglasses manage photosensitivity while also potentially performing data processing functions. There are fan theories suggesting the lenses were custom-engineered by Wesker himself to overlay targeting information, biological scan data, or other tactical intelligence over his field of vision. The original game treats them as a character design element. Later games and supplementary material suggest they served an actual practical purpose for a man whose biology had moved past the human baseline in ways that required technological compensation. Theory 19. Wesker knew exactly what Spencer was planning to do to him, and he played along deliberately. This is one of the more elaborate theories in the franchise's lore community, and it requires holding a lot of information in mind simultaneously. The standard reading of Wesker's arc is that he was Spencer's product, shaped without his knowledge, and eventually discovered the truth about his origins when Spencer revealed it to him in 2006. The revelation prompted his rage and Spencer's death, but there are alternative readings. Wesker was extraordinarily intelligent. He was operating within Umbrella's intelligence division for years before the Mansion incident. He had access to classified files that most people in the corporation never saw. And he was, throughout all of this, asking questions about Spencer's motivations that the official record reflects as innocent curiosity, but which read differently if Wesker already had suspicions about his own origins. Some fans argue that Wesker had pieced together the Project W information long before Spencer confirmed it, that the apparent revelation scene in 2006 was not genuine discovery but performance, that Wesker was not killing Spencer in rage at betrayal but eliminating the last person alive who understood the complete picture of what Wesker was and where he came from. Spencer died not because he told Wesker the truth, but because he was the last witness to it. Theory 20. Wesker's plan in Resident Evil 5 was not genocide. It was forced speciation. Wesker's stated goal in the 5th game was to deploy Ouroboros globally and kill everyone not compatible with the virus. The survivors, those carrying the genetic potential to survive Ouroboros exposure, would become the foundation of his new humanity. This reads, on the surface, as megalomaniac mass murder with evolutionary justification. But the underlying logic is more specific than simple genocide. Wesker believed that the human species had reached an evolutionary plateau, that without external pressure, humanity would continue cycling through the same patterns of conflict and self-destruction indefinitely. The Ouroboros deployment was not about killing people he considered inferior. It was about applying selection pressure so severe that it produced an evolutionary jump in a single generation. The survivors would not just be alive. They would be the genetic cohort capable of bonding with Ouroboros successfully, which in theory meant they carried specific combinations of traits that the virus could interface with. They would be the starting population of whatever came next. Wesker saw himself not as a murderer, but as a geologist detonating a controlled explosion to reshape a mountain. The deaths were the mechanism, not the point. This framing does not make what he intended any less horrific, but understanding the distinction between the stated goal and the underlying logic clarifies why Wesker was not interested in simply killing people. He was interested in what survived the killing. Theory 21. Wesker had a relationship with Ada Wong that went beyond professional use. This one lives squarely in speculation territory, but it keeps coming up in fan analysis for reasons worth exploring. Their professional relationship is documented. Wesker employed Ada to retrieve the Las Plagas sample in Resident Evil 4. She delivered the sample and then provided a fake to Los Illuminados, playing multiple sides simultaneously in a way that served her own interests over his. Wesker was furious. The question some fans ask is whether Ada was the closest thing Wesker had to a genuine intellectual peer in his experience. He surrounded himself with people who were either resources or obstacles. Ada was neither. She operated with her own agenda, her own capabilities, her own reading of every situation. She could not be fully controlled. She could not be entirely predicted. She was in a framework where Wesker viewed almost everyone as a piece on a board to be moved, a piece that occasionally moved itself. Whether that produced something resembling respect or irritation, or a more complicated response than either, the franchise never directly answers. But their dynamic across multiple games consistently suggests that Wesker tracked Ada more carefully than he tracked most of his other assets, which is itself a kind of attention. Theory 22. The volcano scene in Resident Evil 5 was not the plan. Chris adapting was. The ending of Resident Evil 5 is notorious for its spectacle. Chris and Sheva pursue Wesker into an active volcanic environment and ultimately destroy him by shooting rocket propellants into the lava. It is a sequence that strains suspension of disbelief even by Resident Evil standards. But the theory worth considering is not about the logistics of the battle. It is about what the scene reveals about Wesker's fundamental vulnerability. His plans required control. They required the people opposing him to behave predictably and within parameters he had modeled. Chris Redfield, throughout the series, has demonstrated an almost stubborn refusal to behave according to the parameters Wesker modeled. He survives things he should not survive. He makes tactical choices that prioritize the mission over personal survival in ways that produce outcomes Wesker's calculations did not fully account for. The volcanic confrontation was not a planned failure mode for Wesker. It was the result of someone continuing to fight past the point where Wesker expected the fight to stop. And that stubbornness, that human refusal to accept the predetermined outcome, is precisely what the entire Resident Evil franchise keeps returning to as the counterweight to institutional power and viral horror. Section 5. Raccoon City was never an accident. Theory 23. The T-virus contamination of Raccoon City's water supply was not an accident caused by the Birkin confrontation. It was a contingency. The standard account is clear enough. Birkin was shot by the USS Alpha team, injected himself with the G-virus in desperation, hunted the team through the sewers, and in the process destroyed several vials of T-virus that had been present in the facility. Rats consumed the contaminated material and spread the virus through Raccoon City's water supply. The outbreak began. This is the chain of events. But look at the decision-making that preceded it. Umbrella sent a team to forcibly retrieve Birkin's research. They did not simply disable him and take the samples. The confrontation involved lethal force against Birkin himself. Someone at Umbrella, possibly Spencer directly, authorized an operation that was extremely likely to produce exactly the kind of uncontrolled outbreak that followed. There are documents in the extended lore suggesting that Umbrella had been planning a real-world outbreak scenario as a live testing environment for their BOW applications for years. The military contracts that funded a significant portion of Umbrella's operation required demonstration data. Laboratory results were insufficient for the actual sale of deployed weaponry. At some point, in some environment, they needed to prove the products worked at scale. Raccoon City is the right size for a contained live test. The USS was already in position. The contingency protocols for city sterilization already existed, suggesting that someone in the chain of command had already modeled what a full municipal outbreak would look like and prepared a response. The theory is that the Birkin confrontation was not the accidental trigger of an unplanned disaster. It was the deliberate initiation of a planned test, with the Birkin confrontation used as a cover story for how the virus reached the water supply. Theory 24. STARS was always going to be sent into the mansion. Wesker arranged the STARS Bravo team mission specifically so Alpha team would follow. The sequence here requires careful attention. Bravo team was sent to the Arklay Mountains to investigate the unusual deaths in the forest. They disappeared into the mansion. Alpha team, including Wesker, was sent to find them. Both missions were framed as legitimate emergency operations by a police force trying to address a genuine public safety crisis. Wesker was, the whole time, the person coordinating the data collection for Umbrella's Arklay facility. He had known about the state of the facility for months. He knew the T-002 Tyrant prototype was ready for field assessment. He knew the various BOW specimens inside the mansion represented a complete operational test environment. All he needed was a group of trained, capable survivors to move through the facility and generate combat data against the organisms. STARS provided that. The members of STARS Alpha and Bravo teams were among the most competent law enforcement operatives in the region. They were physically capable, tactically experienced, and motivated to survive and complete their mission. They were perfect test subjects not for the virus but for the BOWs. Wesker needed to know how the creatures performed against trained opposition. STARS answered that question for him. He structured both missions to ensure they went into the mansion. He knew they would eventually reach the Tyrant's chamber. He positioned himself to be there, to die, and to be revived by the experimental strain Birkin had provided him. Everything else was data collection, with human beings as the measuring instruments. Theory 25. Barry Burton was not simply blackmailed, he was selected. Barry's situation in the original Resident Evil is one of those narrative threads the franchise established, and then never fully revisited with the depth it deserved. Wesker held Barry's family hostage to ensure his cooperation. Barry planted evidence, withheld information from teammates, and generally served as Wesker's instrument within the Alpha team. He was compromised, and he knew it, and he hated it. But the theory worth considering is that Wesker chose Barry specifically because Barry was the member of the team most likely to have a family worth threatening. He had a wife, daughters, a domestic life he valued profoundly. Wesker's choice of leverage was not random. He had assessed each member of Alpha Team and identified the person whose pressure points would produce the most reliable compliance. This implies a level of prior study that went beyond Wesker's official role as team captain. He had evaluated his people as potential assets long before the mansion incident. He had their files. He had their family information. He had thought through what it would take to compromise each of them if he needed to. Barry was the most compromisable because he had the most to lose. The other implication is that Chris and Jill, who Wesker could not compromise through the same leverage because neither had domestic vulnerabilities of the same kind, were always going to be the ones who survived and discovered the truth. Wesker's selection of Barry as his instrument implicitly selected Chris and Jill as his opponents. Theory 26. The Nemesis program was a direct response to the STARS members surviving Wesker's mansion data collection. The Nemesis T-type, deployed in Raccoon City in Resident Evil 3, has a primary directive that is unusually specific for a BOWW. Its target list consisted of the surviving STARS members. It was engineered to remember its targets, pursue them with tactical intelligence that exceeded standard BOW behavior, and adapt its approach based on prior failed encounters. Nemesis was not a general-purpose bioweapon. It was a specialized elimination tool designed for a specific problem. The problem was that 5 people had survived the mansion incident with direct evidence of Umbrella's criminal operations. They were witnesses. Chris and Jill in particular were actively working to expose Umbrella. The BOW program's standard creatures were not capable of selectively hunting specific individuals through a populated urban environment. Nemesis was built to do exactly that. The theory extends this to argue that the entire Nemesis deployment during the Raccoon City outbreak was not incidental to the outbreak. It was a use of the outbreak as cover. The city was going to collapse anyway. Deploying Nemesis within the outbreak gave Umbrella plausible deniability about its true purpose. The creature was hunting down witnesses in an environment where witnesses dying in a zombie apocalypse attracted no particular scrutiny. Section 6. Ada Wong, the spy without a name. Theory 27. Ada Wong is not her real name, and Ada might not even be a real identity she personally chose. The franchise is explicit about this in scattered references across multiple games. Ada Wong is a pseudonym. The woman who operates under that name is of Chinese-American descent, has professional grade skills in espionage, combat, and information extraction, and has maintained a consistent identity across decades of operating in a field where maintaining consistent false identities is a primary professional skill. What the franchise never confirms is whether the Ada Wong identity is one she created herself or one that was assigned to her by whoever first employed her. There are other names in her story. An epilogue file in Resident Evil 3 describes a woman contemplating saying goodbye to the Ada Wong identity, thinking of a scar on her body as Ada's scar rather than her own. This implies a dissociation between the operative identity and whatever her actual sense of self looks like underneath it. The fan theory that has circulated for years is that Ada entered the world of corporate espionage not as a freelancer building a persona, but as someone recruited and constructed by an organization that gave her the name alongside the training. If that is true, then the mysterious employer she has served across multiple games may not be a client relationship. It may be something older and more complicated. The people who made her who she is professionally may be the same people she technically works for, which would explain why she has never fully walked away from that relationship, despite having the skills and resources to do so. Theory 28. Ada was in Raccoon City before Leon, potentially days before. Leon Kennedy arrives in Raccoon City at the beginning of Resident Evil 2 on his first day as a police officer, driving into a city already in crisis. His entire experience of Raccoon City is reactive. He is responding to a situation already in progress. Ada is already there, operating in the sewers and industrial areas of the city when he encounters her. Her stated mission is to find a G-virus sample for her employer. The G-virus was only announced as close to completion a short time before the outbreak. For Ada's employer to have sent her to Raccoon City to retrieve it, that employer needed to know the G-virus existed and was accessible. Birkin had been conducting his G-virus research under significant secrecy, even within Umbrella. The information pipeline that got Ada to Raccoon City to retrieve a sample that was only recently placed in jeopardy by the outbreak suggests her employer had access to internal Umbrella intelligence at a level that implied either an extremely sophisticated intelligence network or a mole inside Umbrella's inner research circle. Ada's cover story of being a civilian searching for her boyfriend who worked at the Umbrella facility was paper thin. She maintained it for Leon's benefit, because Leon's naivety about her actual purpose made him useful. He kept the infected population between her and the samples she needed. He was, functionally, a resource she managed, even as she developed something genuine in her feeling for him. Those two things coexisted in her simultaneously. She was using him. She also actually cared. The franchise never fully resolves the tension between those two truths. Theory 29. Ada's anonymous employer is possibly a Western intelligence service operating through corporate cutouts. The organization Ada works for is described across multiple games as a rival company to Umbrella in some contexts and as something more ambiguous in others. By Resident Evil 6, the references to her employer suggest an entity with geopolitical reach beyond what a corporate competitor would typically exercise. She is connected to events in China, in Eastern Europe, in the United States. She has intelligence on multiple parallel operations across multiple countries simultaneously. The fan theory that has attracted significant interest is that Ada's ultimate employer is not a corporation at all, that the corporate framing is itself a cover for a government intelligence service or a consortium of national security interests that recognized Umbrella's bioweapons program as both a threat and an opportunity and have been running an operation to monitor, contain, and selectively exploit Umbrella's research for decades. Ada would make sense in this context as an operative whose civilian cover as a corporate spy gives her access to environments that a government agent could not officially enter. The reason this theory never fully resolves is that revealing Ada's true employer would require the franchise to make her story finite in a way it has consistently avoided. As long as her employer is anonymous, Ada can be deployed in any storyline. The mystery is a structural feature, not a gap in the writing. Theory 30. Ada and Leon would have ended up together in a different version of this franchise. The spy organization is the thing that keeps them apart. This one is less a lore theory and more an observation about narrative structure, but it illuminates something real about how the franchise has handled their relationship across more than 2 decades. Every time they interact, there is genuine warmth that neither of them entirely suppresses. He saves her more than once. She saves him more than once. In several encounters, the game explicitly signals mutual feeling that both characters acknowledge and then set aside because of circumstances they cannot change. The circumstance Ada cannot change is her employer. Whatever the nature of that relationship, it constrains her in ways that prevent a normal life with someone like Leon. The theory is that she is not choosing the mystery over him out of preference. She is trapped in an organizational relationship whose terms she did not originally understand when she entered it and now cannot exit. The anonymous employer is not just a narrative mystery. Within the story Ada inhabits, it may be the actual reason she lives the way she does. Theory 31. The Carla Radam storyline in Resident Evil 6 was an attempt to free Ada from that organizational constraint. Simmons, the antagonist of Resident Evil 6's Leon campaign, was obsessed with Ada to the point of psychological dysfunction. He created Carla Radames, a woman physically and psychologically remade through the C virus to be a copy of Ada, specifically because he could not have the original. Carla eventually developed her own identity and turned against him, using the Neo Umbrella organization as her instrument. The interesting theory here is about what Carla's existence meant for the real Ada, not emotionally but operationally. If there was a convincing Ada duplicate operating in the world, running operations, generating intelligence chatter, being observed by the various organizations that tracked Ada's movements, then the real Ada could theoretically disappear. Step out of the intelligence record. Let Carla absorb the attention, while the actual person beneath the Ada Wong identity used the cover of Carla's activities to quietly exit a professional life she had never chosen to be permanent. Whether the real Ada actually attempted this or simply allowed events to unfold as they did, without engineering them, the structural opportunity was there. Carla Radames was, accidentally and against her creator's intentions, a possible exit ramp from a life Ada had been living for decades without the option to stop. Section 7. The Merchants. Impossible Men in Impossible Places. Theory 32. The merchant from Resident Evil 4 is an infected ganado who managed to retain his free will. The original Resident Evil 4 merchant has eyes that glow red at night, the same red glow that indicates Las Plagas infection in the village's population. His skin has a pallor and texture that does not match an uninfected person. He can pass through areas controlled by the infected without being attacked, which would require either that the infected do not perceive him as an outsider or that something about his infection type registers as compatible with theirs. The dominant theory is that he carries a Las Plagas strain that suppressed his cognitive takeover while leaving the physical modification intact. A dominant plaga, the type that allows the host to retain higher intelligence while still being infected, would explain his free will. He retained enough autonomy to develop his own agenda, which appears to involve accumulating wealth and operating as a neutral commercial entity in a landscape everyone else is trying to survive. What makes this theory compelling beyond the red-eye evidence is the behavioral pattern. He has no apparent loyalty to Sadler, despite operating throughout territory Sadler controls. The infected leave him alone. Leon can trade with him without triggering hostility. He occupies a space of functional neutrality that only makes sense if he is simultaneously inside and outside the infection matrix. An infected man whose variant of the infection left him free to choose his own path and chose commerce. Theory 33. The RE4 merchant uses the secret tunnels in the village to move between his locations so quickly. There are documents in the game describing an old network of underground passages beneath the Spanish village, passages associated with Luis Serra's grandfather and old family knowledge about the region. These tunnels connect areas of the map that would take Leon significant time to travel between on the surface. The merchant, who appears to teleport ahead of you through the game, has arrived at your next destination before you because he knows the shortcuts you do not. This is one of those theories that seems mundane compared to the more elaborate supernatural explanations, but is actually more interesting for its specificity. The merchant's impossible mobility is not magic. It is local knowledge. He has spent enough time in this region to know every passage, every shortcut, every route through the underground that the infected either do not know or cannot access. His advantage is geographical intelligence. He is the person who was here before the infection and who understands the architecture of the place better than anyone else currently operating in it. Theory 34. In the Resident Evil 4 remake, the merchant uses the word "we" when referring to himself, suggesting he is not one person. This was noticed by players almost immediately after the remake released. In several dialogue exchanges, the merchant uses plural first-person language in contexts where a single individual would not. We can help with that. We have what you need. The plural is subtle enough that it could be dismissed as an affectation, the kind of royal we that eccentric characters sometimes adopt. But in a franchise that has established the existence of hive-mind organisms, distributed consciousness, and biological entities that maintain multiple physical instantiations simultaneously, the plural usage carries more weight than a simple speech pattern. The theory is that there are multiple merchants, not clones in the conventional sense, but perhaps related individuals, siblings or family members, who operate the same commercial operation across different locations. The reason you encounter the same face in multiple places is not because one man is moving faster than physically possible. It is because you are encountering different members of the same family operation, each covering their assigned territory. The consistent appearance would require explanation, but the franchise has established enough genetic engineering and biological manipulation that identical appearing individuals with family relationships is not an extraordinary claim. Theory 35. The Duke from Resident Evil Village and the merchant from Resident Evil 4 may be fundamentally the same kind of entity. The Duke himself, when he catches himself using the merchant's signature phrase, attributes it to an old friend. That phrasing has always been the most direct textual link between the two characters the franchise has provided. Old friend, not a category of person, a specific individual, someone the Duke knew personally. If the merchant is a Plaga-infected individual with retained free will, and if the Duke is a megamycete-connected entity with origins he does not fully understand, then the connection between them might run through the bioweapon research networks that link the franchise's events. Both men appear in locations associated with significant bioweapon activity. Both have access to resources that should not be available in the environments they operate in. Both demonstrate knowledge that exceeds what their stated roles as merchants would justify. Both survive encounters that should kill them. The broader theory is that there exists in the Resident Evil universe a class of entity that bioweapon exposure creates occasionally and unpredictably. Beings who were changed by infectious organisms in ways that neither killed them nor assimilated them into the monster category. They fall into a third category that the franchise has never formally named. Not human in the original sense. Not BOW in the weaponized sense. Something in between. Observers. Survivors in a very particular way. The Merchant and the Duke are the franchise's two clearest examples of this category, and the story connecting them is one the series has been building toward for 2 decades. Theory 36. The Duke knows when people are going to die, and uses this knowledge to position himself advantageously. This connects to the Duke's seemingly supernatural ability to appear wherever Ethan needs supplies. The most charitable supernatural explanation is that the Duke has some form of precognitive ability derived from his connection to the megamycete's collective consciousness. The fungal network archives information across time. If sufficient biological data exists within the network about likely future states, something interfaced with that network might have probabilistic awareness of near-future events without it constituting true prophecy. The Duke knows roughly where Ethan is going to be because the megamycete's archived patterns generate probabilistic maps of how events unfold in environments saturated with fungal presence. He is not reading the future. He is reading the accumulated behavioral data of the environment and calculating what is most likely to happen next. His precision looks supernatural, but might be extremely sophisticated pattern recognition, drawing on a biological database that predates human civilization. What he does with this information is show up with weapons and supplies at the locations Ethan will need them. Whether this is generosity, self-interest, or something that functions as conscience in an entity whose moral framework we do not fully understand, the franchise does not say. But the Duke consistently acts in ways that help survivors, which within the context of everything else the megamycete does, is anomalous enough to require explanation. Section 8. The Mold Knows Everything. Theory 37. The megamycete has been influencing human civilization in the Eastern European region for thousands of years without anyone realizing it. The evidence the franchise provides is primarily archaeological and anthropological. The cave where the megamycete's central mass is located shows signs of human interaction going back generations. Infected individuals in the 15th century were documented as monsters by communities with no biological framework for what they were witnessing. Villages in the region experienced episodes of unusual mutation and behavior that local historians attributed to everything from demonic activity to divine punishment. The megamycete does not think in human terms and does not pursue human legible goals, but it does expand. It does consume and archive. And in consuming the biological material of every organism that dies in its reach, It has been accumulating information about human civilization in its specific geographic zone for longer than most of those civilizations can remember. The theory that emerges from this is that the Megamycete is not simply a passive archive. The information it has gathered over millennia includes enough behavioral data about human communities that it generates environmental conditions that produce more human interaction with it. Not through any conscious design, but through the same mechanisms that cause mycorrhizal networks to grow toward nutritional sources. The mold grows toward the biological richness that human death provides. Communities built near the cave system have always experienced slightly higher rates of unusual disease and transformation. Those communities develop folklore and ritual around what they are experiencing. That folklore draws investigators, researchers, and curious people who eventually make contact. Miranda was not the first person who found the cave and made contact with the Megamycete. She was simply the first person with enough scientific training to understand what she had found and the willingness to stay. Theory 38. Evelyn was not a failure. The connections got exactly what they built her for. Evelyn is presented in Resident Evil 7 as a bioweapon that escaped containment and went catastrophically wrong. Her designers intended a subtle mind control asset. What they got was a psychologically unstable child-shaped organism with enormous destructive power and no interest in following anyone's orders. The Baker incident, the mold outbreak in Louisiana, the events leading to Ethan's involvement, all of this reads as catastrophic failure. But consider what the connections actually documented from the Baker incident. 3 years of observation data on a single mold-infected organism's behavioral patterns in a contained rural environment. Documentation of the mold's spread rate, its mutation patterns, its behavioral influence on infected hosts, its ability to create fully molded creatures. The Annabelle disaster destroyed one of their transport vessels and resulted in significant collateral damage, but it also produced a real-world deployment scenario that no controlled laboratory test could replicate. Lucas Baker, kept partially free of Evelyn's control through the Connection's own serum, served as their on-site monitor throughout the incident. He filed reports. He provided data. When Chris Redfield's team eventually arrived, the Connections had already extracted 3 years of operational data from what appeared to everyone else to be an uncontrolled disaster. The theory is that not calling it a successful test is only accurate if success meant Evelyn behaving as instructed. If success meant generating the kind of real-world data that informs the next iteration of the E-series, then the Baker incident was not a failure at all. Theory 39. The Megamycete archived Evelyn when she died, and that archived consciousness is still present in whatever fragment the BSAA recovered. Evelyn died in the Baker estate. Her death was caused by a concentrated neurotoxin derived from the D-series material Mia had preserved. Her physical form disintegrated, but the Megamycete had been present in the Baker estate's environment through 3 years of Evelyn's activity there. The mold she spread was, essentially, a local network of the same organism. When Ethan encountered a fragment of Evelyn's consciousness in the space between his death and his revival, that fragment existed because the Megamycete had archived her the way it archived everything that died in mold-saturated environments. Evelyn's archived consciousness was still present in the Megamycete network at the time Miranda was pursuing her research. This is confirmed by the post-death encounter Ethan has with her in Village, but Miranda's ceremony involved the Central Mass. After the village's destruction, the BSAA confirmed they had recovered a fragment of the Megamycete for containment and study purposes. If Evelyn's consciousness patterns are present in that fragment, as they would be based on the Megamycete's established archiving behavior, then the BSAA is currently holding a sample of biological material that contains an archived copy of a bioweapon designed to control minds. They may not know this. Their testing protocols are likely looking for standard infectious properties, not for the presence of consciousness patterns in fungal tissue. A mycological sample that passes infectious disease screening would be classified as contained and potentially approved for continued research, which would mean Evelyn is still out there, waiting in a petri dish in a BSAA laboratory, being cultured by scientists who have no idea what they are actually growing. Theory 40. Mother Miranda was the longest-running cult leader in Resident Evil history, and her model was directly adopted by every later bioweapon-adjacent organization. Miranda established control over her village population through a specific sequence. Arrive during a crisis. Offer a solution that only you can provide. Frame the solution in religious terms that the community's existing belief framework can accommodate. Use the grateful dependency that crisis relief creates to establish authority before the community has stabilized enough to evaluate you critically. Maintain that authority through a combination of genuine benefit delivery and implicit threat. Umbrella ran the same sequence on the bioweapons customers and governments they worked with. Arrive with a potential solution to a national security crisis. Offer the bioweapons program. Frame the offering in patriotic and security terms the national defense establishment already accepts. Use the relationship with national security infrastructure to maintain corporate protection before anyone with regulatory authority has assessed the actual risk. Keep the arrangement going through genuine delivery of tactical intelligence while maintaining the implicit threat that walking away from the arrangement means your competitors get the technology instead. Los Illuminados under Sadler ran the same sequence in their Spanish village. The Connections runs a contemporary version of it. The cult structure is not coincidental. It is the most efficient mechanism available for maintaining compliance in a population that cannot be directly coerced. Miranda invented it in the Resident Evil universe, at least at the bioweapon scale, and Spencer imported the methodology when he imported her scientific knowledge. Theory 41. Miranda knew her resurrection ceremony would not produce Eva. She continued anyway. This is the darkest theory about Miranda, and it requires sitting with some uncomfortable implications. The consciousness that the Megamycete archived when Eva died in 1919 was described even in Miranda's own journals as incomplete. The burial site was close enough to the cave network for the mold to reach Eva's body, but the archiving process had only partially absorbed her neural patterns before decomposition progressed too far for full preservation. Miranda was a biologist. She understood what partial archiving meant. She understood that a consciousness stored incompletely would not emerge as the complete person. Whatever came through the transfer ceremony would have Eva's fragments, her emotional imprints, some of her memories, but it would also have gaps. It would not be her daughter the way her daughter had actually been. It would be a reconstruction from incomplete data, shaped by whatever host body received it and influenced by that host's own biology. The theory is that Miranda understood this and chose not to let herself know it, that the century of research was not really aimed at resurrecting Eva, but at maintaining the project of trying to resurrect Eva, because as long as the project continued, she had a reason to keep going. The moment she completed it and faced the reality that what came through was not quite Eva, she would have nothing left. The work was the point, not the outcome. She kept the outcome permanently in the future because arriving at it would have been worse than the search. Section 9. Ethan Winters was already dead. Theory 42. The Baker family loved Ethan specifically because they recognized him as the same kind of thing they had become. Jack Baker was infected with Evelyn's mold. The Baker family underwent fundamental cellular transformation through that infection. When Ethan arrived at the estate and was killed in the guest house, the mold that resurrected him created a being whose cellular structure was identical to the Bakers at a fundamental level. They were all mold-wearing human shapes. Evelyn wanted a family, and the Bakers were the family she had constructed for herself. She pulled Ethan into that framework because he was, biologically, already family, not metaphorically, not in the chosen family emotional sense. In the literal mycological sense, he was the same organism they were, part of the same network. The way the infection spread between the Bakers was the same mechanism that was keeping Ethan functional after his death. Evelyn's insistence that he join the family was not entirely irrational possessiveness. It was, from the mold's perspective, accurate recognition. The Bakers' various attempts to kill Ethan are, through this lens, deeply ironic. They kept trying to destroy something they were biologically continuous with, in service of an entity whose entire framework was built on the desire to hold family together. The dysfunction was structural before it was personal. Theory 43. Mia knew Ethan was dead within weeks of their return from Louisiana. Her behavior in the years before Village is explained by this knowledge. Mia had been Evelyn's handler. She understood the mold's biology better than almost anyone outside the Connections research division. When she watched Ethan reattach his severed hand with basic medical supplies, when she watched wounds close at a rate no human body could manage, she knew what she was seeing. She had spent years with Evelyn's mold. She had been infected herself. She understood what the organism did to dead hosts. The theory is that her return to civilian life with Ethan was not the uncomplicated reunion it appeared to be. She was living with a man she loved who was not quite the man she had loved before. The cellular structure was identical. The memories were intact. The personality was continuous. But the biology was fungal, and the legal, medical, and philosophical status of what she was sharing a life with was something no institution, no relationship counselor, no grief framework had any category for. She maintained the secret for years. She never told Ethan what she knew, whether this was compassion, cowardice, or a calculated decision that the information served no useful purpose once the practical outcome of his continued function was stable. The franchise leaves ambiguous. What it does not leave ambiguous is that she knew. Theory 44. Rose experienced her father's consciousness directly through the Megamycete during the Shadow of Rose DLC, and this raises the possibility that Ethan is recoverable. In the Shadows of Rose DLC, teenage Rose enters the Megamycete's realm, a kind of psychological and biological interior space the organism generates that houses the archived consciousnesses it has accumulated. Within this space, she encounters her father, not a memory, not a simulation. An actual communication with something that retains Ethan's awareness and, crucially, his knowledge of current events in Rose's life. Things he could not know from archived memories because they happened after his death. If the Ethan in that space has current awareness, he is not simply a historical record. He is a present consciousness experiencing ongoing reality from within the Megamycete's network. This makes him functionally alive in the same sense that a person living inside a biological computer is functionally alive, regardless of what their physical substrate is made of. Miranda spent a century working to transfer Eva's consciousness from Megamycete storage into a compatible biological host. The methodology was proven sound in principle, even if her specific attempt was prevented. The infrastructure of knowledge for performing that transfer exists in the research materials that survived the village incident. The question the franchise has been carefully positioning is not whether Ethan can be brought back. The question is what it would cost. Theory 45. Chris Redfield has known for years that Ethan was not biologically human and chose to protect him anyway. Chris's intelligence network is established across multiple games as thorough enough to have identified anomalies in the Winters family's profiles. He was aware of Mia's connection to the connections. He had reason to believe the witness protection arrangement was not providing adequate insight into the biological state of the people under protection. When his team ultimately raided the Winters' home at the beginning of Village, the operation was framed as a response to a specific threat, but the preparedness of the response suggests surveillance that had been ongoing for some time. The theory is that somewhere in the intelligence data Chris had accumulated, the conclusion about Ethan's biological nature was visible: the healing rate. The tissue samples from the post-Dolby examination that should have been flagged by a sufficiently attentive analysis. Chris is not a scientist, but he works with people who are. If his team had been watching the Winters family closely enough to identify Miranda's presence as a threat, they had been watching closely enough to observe biological anomalies in Ethan, and Chris protected him anyway. He intervened at the end of Village knowing what Ethan was. He told Ethan about Mia. He gave him reason to fight. He got out of Ethan's way when Ethan chose to stay behind. A man who had spent his career eliminating biological threats chose, when confronted with one he personally knew, to act as that person's friend rather than his handler. That decision humanizes both of them in a way the franchise rarely pauses to acknowledge. Section 10. Rose, the connections, and what comes next. Theory 46. Rosemary Winters is the most significant biological entity in Resident Evil history, and multiple organizations are currently studying her from a distance. Rose is confirmed as the first human being conceived from two mold-infected parents, both of whom were entirely mold at the cellular level at the time of her conception. Her biology has no human cell baseline. Everything she is, from her cellular chemistry to her brain structure, is mold organized according to developmental patterns drawn from her parents' genetic blueprints. This makes her, from a research perspective, extraordinary. Not because of the abilities this grants her, though those are substantial, but because she represents proof of concept for several different research agendas simultaneously. She proves that mold-based biology can produce a viable, intelligent, emotionally functional, human-shaped organism across a full developmental arc from conception through childhood to adulthood. She proves that consciousness, memory, and personality can develop normally within a mold substrate. She proves that whatever the megamycete's cellular replacement process preserves, it preserves enough to be a complete person. Every organization with interests in the bioweapon research space has reason to want to study her. The BSAA, which officially protects her, has interests that are not entirely humanitarian. Blue Umbrella, which inherited aspects of the original corporation's research mission, would have obvious incentives. The Connections, which monitored her parents throughout their witness protection period, and whose intelligence chains ultimately led Miranda to Rose in the first place, never stopped existing as an organization after Village's events. Rose is 16 in the Shadow of Rose DLC and aware that her situation is not stable. She manages her abilities badly enough to need help from an entity she barely understands to control them. She has been effectively raised by Chris Redfield rather than by her surviving parent. Her mother is referenced but absent. She is, for all the strangeness of her biology, a teenager navigating a world that has been waiting to use her since before she was born. Theory 47. The Connections have been continuing their E-Series research, and Rose is the template for their next iteration. Evelyn was the first E-Series bioweapon, created from mold samples provided by Miranda and engineered to produce a mind control asset in a human-shaped package. The project dated back to 1999, according to Mia's background information. That means the Connections had been working on mold-based bioweapons for years before Evelyn was deployed. After Evelyn's neutralization, after the Village incident, after the BSAA's engagement with Miranda's mold research, the Connections had more information about mold biology than any previous iteration of the research had possessed. They knew about the megamycete. They had access to fragments of it through their ongoing relationship with BSAA intelligence channels. They had documented the existence of Rose and her unique biological profile. The theory is that the next E-Series development cycle has Rose's biological architecture as its template, not Rose herself as a subject, at least not officially. But her existence proves that full mold genesis is viable, that a being can be born from mold parents and develop normally. If you can engineer the equivalent of that genesis artificially, if you can create synthetic Ethan and Mia biology and produce offspring from it, you get something with Rose's capabilities on a replicable production basis rather than as a single unique occurrence. The Connections' goal was always controllable mind-influenced bioweapons. Evelyn was uncontrollable, Rose is more stable. The architecture of her biology might produce something controllable where Evelyn was not. Theory 48. The Elpis compound from Resident Evil Requiem rewrites everything we thought we knew about Spencer's endgame. Elpis, introduced in Resident Evil 9, Requiem was Spencer's secret final project. It was framed within the game as a potential mind control weapon. The Connections sent Zeno and Victor Gideon to retrieve it. What it actually turned out to be was the opposite of what everyone expected. Not a weapon for producing compliance. An antiviral, a universal cure for all progenitor virus-derived strains. A compound that could neutralize the T virus, the G virus, the C virus, the mold. All of it. Spencer built a cure. The founder of Umbrella Corporation, the man responsible for more deaths through bioweapon deployment than any other single figure in the franchise's history, spent his final years developing something that could undo everything he had done. The password for releasing Elpis was hope. The theory about what this means for everything that came before is uncomfortable in its implications. If Spencer built Elpis late in his life, was this genuine remorse, as Requiem suggests some characters believe? Or was it the final expression of the same control impulse that defined his entire life? A cure that only he possessed was not humanitarian. It was leverage, the most powerful leverage imaginable. In a world ravaged by the bioweapons he had created, the person who held a universal cure held all of the power. Spencer did not build Elpis to save humanity. He built it to be the person who could save humanity, which would have made him the most powerful human being alive. He died before he could deploy it as leverage. Chris's encounter with it in Requiem prevented Zeno from weaponizing it, but the cure exists. It works. And the question hanging over the franchise's future is who decides how to use it, for what purpose, and whether the act of using it will be treated as the benevolent intervention it could theoretically be or the power consolidation it was almost certainly designed to become. Theory 49. Leon Kennedy has been quietly protecting civilians from bioweapon exposure for years without official authorization. Leon operates in a gray zone between the BSAA's official mandate and what he personally decides is necessary. His government employment has been inconsistent across multiple games, sometimes as a U.S. government agent, sometimes in ambiguous operational status. What remains consistent is that he shows up in environments with bioweapon activity and acts on his own judgment about what needs to happen. The theory is that Leon has developed, over years of operational experience, an unofficial network of informants, survivors, and former assets who feed him intelligence about emerging bioweapon situations before they become large enough to require official government response. He then conducts what amount to private interdiction operations, small-scale, deniable, outside official channels, to prevent those situations from escalating. This would explain why he has access to resources and intelligence that his official status does not clearly justify. It would explain why he appears in locations where no government mandate has sent him. And it would make him, quietly, one of the most active individual forces for bioweapon containment in the franchise's current timeline, operating entirely outside the institutional frameworks that keep failing to contain the problem on their own. Theory 50. Sherry Birkin is one of the most important characters in the franchise, and has been systematically underutilized because her full story is being held for a future game. Sherry survived Raccoon City as a child, infected with the G virus by her father and subsequently treated. The treatment left her with an accelerated healing ability derived from the residual G virus in her system. She grew up under government protection, eventually became a government agent herself, and appeared in Resident Evil 6 as a genuinely compelling adult character navigating a world defined by her father's legacy. Then she effectively disappeared from the franchise's narrative. Occasional references, no playable appearance since 6. The theory held by a significant portion of the fanbase is that Sherry's story is not finished, that the G-virus remnant in her system is biologically active in ways that have not been fully documented, that she carries something in her biology that is relevant to the current storyline involving Rose, the connections, and Elpis, and that she is being held back narratively for a moment when her presence will carry maximum weight. She is also Jake Muller's partner, and Jake's unique immunological profile, derived from his father Albert Wesker's genetics, is directly relevant to the ongoing bioweapon arms race the franchise documents. Two people who both carry unusual viral resistance and are both connected to some of the most significant biological events in the franchise's history have been off-screen together for over a decade. The theory is not that this is an oversight. The theory is that it is a promise. Theory 51. Blue Umbrella is Umbrella Corporation with new branding and the same internal culture. Blue Umbrella was introduced as a reformed successor to the original corporation, a private military organization that had inherited some of Umbrella's assets and expertise, but now operated in the interest of bioweapon containment rather than development. Chris Redfield's Hound Wolf Squad operates alongside Blue Umbrella elements. The organization presents as a legitimate private security contractor with a specific bioweapon remediation mandate. The uncomfortable theory is that the institutional culture of a corporation is not changed by rebranding. The same people who worked at Umbrella, the scientists, the logistics specialists, the intelligence analysts who were not caught and prosecuted, simply continued working in the successor organization. They brought their methodologies, their attitudes toward acceptable casualties, and their professional relationships with government and military clients. The new name is not accompanied by new ethics. It is accompanied by better public relations. When the BSAA was discovered to be deploying bioweapon-enhanced soldiers in Resident Evil Village's end sequence, it was a moment of institutional horror that should have resonated as completely predictable rather than surprising. Organizations that exist to contain biological weapons inevitably develop operational interests in those weapons. The containment mission requires expertise that can only be acquired through development. Blue Umbrella, if sufficiently examined, might look considerably less reformed than its presentation suggests. Theory 52. Hunk is not one person. He is a title passed between Umbrella operatives who meet a specific profile. Hunk, the legendary USS agent known as Mr. Death for his habit of being the sole survivor of every operation he is assigned to, appears multiple times across Resident Evil history, in contexts that span decades and operational environments. His survival rate is extraordinary to the point of being statistically impossible for a single individual. Every team he has been part of has been eliminated while he alone walks out. The theory is that Hunk is an identity designation rather than a personal name. When a sufficiently lethal, sufficiently loyal USS operative meets the criteria for the designation, they receive the Hunk call sign, the suit, the mission parameters, the institutional reputation. Each Hunk inherits the legend of the previous ones, which serves Umbrella's interests by maintaining a mythology of invulnerability around what is actually a role occupied by multiple people across multiple decades. This would explain the supernatural quality of his survival statistics. Not one man surviving everything. Multiple men, each inheriting a title whose previous holders are now dead, continuing an operational tradition that produces consistent results because the selection criteria for the designation are extremely rigorous. Theory 53. The Nemesis was sentient and in pain throughout Resident Evil 3. This one is harder to sit with than most. The Nemesis T-type is presented as a hunting machine. It pursues Jill, deploys weapons with tactical intelligence, recovers from injuries, and escalates its approach in response to failed attempts. From a gameplay perspective, it is the perfect threat. From a lore perspective, it is a BOW with a directive. But the NE alpha parasite that formed the core of Nemesis's intelligent behavior was not simply a control chip. It was an organism with its own biological drives. The host body it was implanted into, a T-103 clone, had its own cellular memory of the human form it was derived from. The combination of a parasitic organism that had to fight its host body's biological resistance while simultaneously executing complex behavioral directives in an environment filled with things trying to destroy it was not a frictionless operational condition. The theory is that Nemesis experienced something analogous to suffering throughout its deployment. The NE alpha parasite striving against the host biology, the host biology fighting the parasite, both of them directed toward a target that kept damaging them, forcing recovery cycles that the underlying biology processed as something functionally similar to pain. Nemesis kept coming, not because it lacked the capacity for self-preservation instinct, but because the mission directive in the parasite overrode the host body's instinct towards self-preservation. It died eventually. Its final mutation, after sufficient biological damage, was not a triumph. It was a last resort of a dying organism trying to complete a mission that had been given to it by people who did not consider the quality of its experience relevant information. Theory 54. The plant creatures across multiple Resident Evil games are more intelligent than the franchise acknowledges. Plants infected with the T-virus or similar organisms appear in several games, beginning with the Plant 42 in the original Resident Evil. These creatures are typically treated as environmental hazards rather than characters. They have no dialogue, no apparent agenda beyond consuming biological matter, no evident experience of their situation. But some of the behaviors documented in these infected plant organisms suggest stimulus-response complexity that goes beyond what a simple reactive organism should produce. Plant 42 actively sealed off the ventilation systems that introduced the herbicide capable of harming it. The IV variants in Resident Evil 2 developed behavioral plasticity in response to environmental threats that standard plant biology cannot account for. Something in the viral mutation that produced these organisms moved them along the spectrum of biological awareness in a direction that the franchise has consistently declined to explore. The uncomfortable implication is that destroying these organisms may not have been morally neutral in the way destroying a mutated tree would be. They experienced, not as humans do, not with the complexity of the consciousness the megamycete preserves, but with something, and no one in the franchise has ever asked. Theory 55. The U.S. government's decision to bomb Raccoon City was made before the outbreak reached its peak. The decision was made when it became clear that Birkin was going to sell the G-virus. This recontextualizes the Raccoon City disaster significantly. The standard framing is that the government destroyed the city to contain the outbreak once it became clear containment was impossible, an emergency response to a crisis that had exceeded normal intervention parameters. But documents from the Raccoon trials and supplementary materials suggest the government was aware of the deal Birkin was attempting to arrange with the U.S. military. They had authorized the military contact. They knew what was in the lab beneath the city. When Umbrella's USS team moved to prevent the deal, the government's intelligence apparatus was watching the situation develop. The timeline from USS deployment to city destruction is compressed enough that the decision to destroy Raccoon City may have been made not in response to an uncontrollable outbreak, but in response to the outbreak's existence, making the decision politically viable. In other words, the government did not bomb Raccoon City because they had to. They bombed it because the outbreak gave them a justification that their own role in what happened beneath the city might otherwise not have survived scrutiny. Destroying the city destroyed the evidence of their own complicity. Theory 56. Jill Valentine was exposed to enough bioweapon compounds during her career that her biology is subtly but permanently altered. Jill's exposure history is extensive even by Resident Evil standards. Raccoon City. The extended stay in a mansion and police station saturated with T-virus. The Nemesis encounters, including at least one direct injection of the NE-alpha parasite during a late confrontation. The prolonged Wesker control period in Resident Evil 5, during which she was kept in a state of extreme biological stress by compounds designed to hijack her nervous system. Each of these exposures would have left residue, not enough to mutate her into a BOWW. She processed and survived each one. But the cumulative effect of years of bioweapon exposure on a human immune system and endocrine system would produce changes. Enhanced resilience to future exposures, possibly accelerated healing at a level above baseline human but below the dramatic regeneration of the fully infected. Subtle alterations to cognitive processing that she might not even recognize as different from her normal state. Jill is, in this reading, a slow burn example of the kind of accidental biological modification that the franchise tends to treat as clean and binary. You are either human or you are changed. The theory suggests the line is considerably blurrier in the real biological mechanics the franchise depicts. Theory 57. Leon Kennedy's remarkable survival rate is not luck. He has subconscious behavioral patterns that consistently position him to survive situations that kill everyone around him. Leon is an ordinary human being in a franchise full of enhanced individuals, virus-modified super soldiers, and infected organisms. He has no viral enhancement, no genetic modification, no parasitic augmentation. He survives because he is exceptionally good at surviving. The theory is that Leon's survival capability is not a personality trait or a matter of good fortune. It is a learned behavioral pattern developed from his very first exposure to the Raccoon City outbreak on what was supposed to be his first day as a police officer. That night, in a city full of the dead and the dying, with no training in bioweapon response and no preparation for anything like what he was experiencing, Leon survived by making choices that were consistently, instinctively correct. Not tactically optimal in any textbook sense, but correct for his specific situation, which he processed at a speed and accuracy that suggests something unusual about his threat assessment capability. By the time Leon had survived Raccoon City, a village in Spain, and multiple international bioterrorism incidents, his subconscious threat response system had been trained by experience that no simulation could replicate. He does not think about survival in high-stress environments. He does not plan it. He acts. And the action is consistently survival-oriented in ways he could not articulate as strategy if asked. He has become, through exposure and experience, something that looks like luck from the outside, and is something more like mastery from the inside. Theory 58. The Raccoon City trials were not meant to produce accountability. They were meant to establish the legal framework for the next phase of government bioweapon programs. The Raccoon trials ended with Umbrella's dissolution. Spencer fled. The company was held liable and declared bankrupt. This reads as justice being done, or at least accountability being enforced. The corporation responsible for the deaths of 100,000 people was destroyed. But who benefited from that outcome? The governments that had been Umbrella's primary bioweapon customers were not implicated. The research that Umbrella had developed, now without a corporate owner, became available to be quietly absorbed by government programs and successor organizations. Blue Umbrella inherited aspects of the corporate structure. Tricell, which developed the Ouroboros project, absorbed Umbrella research through legitimate business acquisition. The government itself recovered research data through the legal process. The theory is that the Raccoon trials were not an accountability exercise. They were a controlled demolition of a corporate structure that had become a liability, designed to allow the research and the relationships to continue under new organizational frameworks with better legal protection. Umbrella died. The work continued. The governments that had purchased the products were protected from any scrutiny of their own role. This is institutional capture of a legal process, rather than justice delivered through one. Before we continue, I want to take a breath here. We are well past the halfway point of this journey, and there are more theories still waiting. If you have made it this far, you are exactly the kind of person who finds this as fascinating as I do. The franchise rewards patience. It rewards the people who notice the dates on the files and count the years and ask what happened in the gap. Let us keep going. Theory 59. All the bioweapon organizations across Resident Evil's timeline are ultimately funded by the same pool of government money routed through different corporate shells. This one ties a lot of threads together. Umbrella received government contracts. The Connections has documented ties to the U.S. government. Tricell had African government contracts for resource extraction that funded its bioweapon development. The Family, the shadowy organization in Resident Evil 6 that had global political influence, was essentially a steering committee for the political class that benefited from controlled bioweapon capability. The theory is that the bioweapon industrial complex in the Resident Evil universe is not a collection of competing organizations. It is a single network with multiple visible nodes, each of which can be sacrificed, prosecuted, or publicly destroyed while the network itself continues operating. When Umbrella fell, the network did not lose capability. It rerouted through Tricell and Blue Umbrella and the Connections. When those organizations faced pressure, the network rerouted again. The money that funds this network comes primarily from defense budgets, multiple governments, all of them quietly contributing to a shared research infrastructure through deniable corporate intermediaries. The organizations are fronts. The actual capability is distributed across the network in ways that make any single prosecution irrelevant to the overall program. Theory 60. The progenitor virus flower is not extinct. Spencer's agents failed to completely eliminate it from the West African highlands. Spencer's campaign to control the progenitor virus supply was thorough but not complete. The original plant grew in the Sun Garden, which Umbrella acquired, and from which they extracted samples. But the flower's natural range extended beyond that single site, growing in crevices where the right mineral water and sun angle combined. A full eradication of a plant species from a remote mountain region using 1960s-era corporate resources would have been extraordinarily difficult. The theory is that some specimens survived in locations Spencer's teams either did not find or did not prioritize. In the decades since Umbrella's collapse, the region has been significantly less monitored. If the flower is still growing somewhere in the highlands of West Africa, then the progenitor virus's original source material is accessible to anyone who knows where to look and is motivated enough to find it. Given the bioweapon arms race the franchise depicts, the people motivated to find it have never gone away. Theory 61. The Resident Evil outbreak scenarios follow a predictable pattern because they are being replicated deliberately by someone who is studying them. This is the grand unifying theory that some longtime fans have circulated for years. Every major outbreak in the franchise follows a recognizable structural pattern: an isolated or semi-isolated population, viral introduction through either accident or deliberate contamination, initial denial or misinterpretation of symptoms, rapid escalation beyond containment capacity, the arrival of one or more protagonists who are uniquely positioned to survive and gather data, the eventual containment or destruction of the affected area. The theory is that this pattern is not coincidental. It is a protocol. Someone has been designing outbreak scenarios using this template and studying the results. The isolated population controls the test environment. The initial denial phase allows the infection to establish before intervention complicates the data. The escalation phase generates the specific BOW behavior data the study requires. The protagonists are variables, essentially enhanced survivor observers, who generate the most valuable data in the scenario. The containment at the end resets the environment for the next iteration. If this is true, then every game in the franchise is simultaneously a horror story and a laboratory report. The characters are running a test. They do not know they are running. The organizations behind the test are watching. They have been watching since Raccoon City, possibly since before Raccoon City. Theory 62. Lisa Trevor, the oldest surviving human test subject in Umbrella history, may not have died in the Spencer Mansion's destruction. Lisa Trevor was the daughter of the architect George Trevor, who designed the Spencer Mansion. She was abducted by Umbrella in 1967 and used as a continuous test subject for 30 years. The progenitor virus was introduced to her system as one of the earliest human trials. Rather than dying from the exposure, she adapted. The progenitor strain in her system integrated with subsequent viral exposures in ways that produced a unique compound variant, the initial pathway toward what Birkin eventually formalized as the G virus. Lisa was functionally immortal. Every lethal experiment performed on her was recovered from. Her biology had become so adapted to viral exposure that it processed mutagens that killed every other test subject as routine cellular nutrition. She was also psychologically destroyed, stripped of coherent identity over 30 years of isolation and experimentation, left with only fragmented memories of her mother and an obsessive mourning for a family that had been dismantled to put her where she was. She was confined in the Spencer Mansion's underground areas. The mansion was destroyed in the outbreak. The official record treats her as deceased, but Lisa's biology, by 1998, had processed so many lethal exposures that the word deceased required qualification. She had survived things that should have been definitively fatal multiple times. The theory that she survived the mansion's destruction, dragging herself through the collapse with whatever physical integrity her extraordinary resilience could maintain, has never been confirmed or definitively refuted by the franchise. Theory 63. Resident Evil has been quietly implying that the viral research and the players who survive it are contributing to the next phase of human evolution, even without the apocalyptic scenarios Spencer envisioned. This is perhaps the most optimistic theory in a franchise defined by institutional horror and biological nightmare. Spencer wanted to force an evolutionary leap through viral catastrophe. He failed. The apocalyptic pathway to a new humanity was closed when he died, and Wesker died, and Ouroboros was never deployed globally. But the incremental pathway may be ongoing. Every person who survives significant bioweapon exposure and recovers carries some residual biological adaptation. Jill Valentine's compromised and recovered immune system, Leon's accumulated survival conditioning, Chris's physical capabilities, which in the Resident Evil 7 timeline are extraordinary for a human without viral enhancement. Sherry's G-virus-derived healing, Jake's unique viral resistance from his father's genetics. These individuals, and presumably others who survived localized outbreaks across multiple games, constitute a population whose collective biology has been tested against viral pressures that no normal human population has faced. They survived. They are alive. They are, some of them, having children or may have children. Whatever the accumulated viral exposures have done to their biology, they are passing modified immune systems and physiological adaptations to the next generation. Spencer's eugenics dream was murderous, and his methods were monstrous. But the franchise may be quietly suggesting that evolution does not wait for anyone's permission. In the survivors of Raccoon City, of the Baker incident, of the village, something is changing, not dramatically, not visibly, but at the level of biology that takes generations to manifest. Something is different. The world the franchise depicts is slowly, without anyone planning it, producing the population Spencer tried to engineer by force, just at the pace biology actually moves, which is slower and quieter and harder to see coming, but ultimately more real than any catastrophic intervention. Final section. 100 Theories More, Theory 64. The Resident Evil 4 Remake's Merchant winking at the camera during the original's recreated Merchant scene was not just a meta-joke. It was acknowledgement that the character exists at a level of narrative that knows it is a story. Theory 65. The Ashford family's decline after Alexia's death was engineered by Spencer, who found the Ashford genetic research threatening enough to want the bloodline eliminated. Theory 66. Alfred Ashford's delusion of being Alexia was not simply grief-induced psychosis. The T. Veronica strain he had incidentally been exposed to through proximity to Alexia's experiments accelerated a pre-existing dissociative condition. Theory 67. The Antarctic facility destroyed in Code Veronica preserved copies of research that Umbrella has since quietly recovered through salvage operations conducted under the cover of legitimate Antarctic resource extraction. Theory 68, the T. veronica strain that Steve Burnside was infected with, recovered by Wesker, was never successfully replicated for bioweapon application because it required a specific genetic profile to produce enhancement rather than immediate death. Wesker understood that profile was rare enough to be useless at scale. Theory 69. Carla Radames, the Ada clone from Resident Evil 6, genuinely believed she was the original Ada for an extended period after her transformation. The C-virus reconstruction of her psychology was complete enough that the memories she received as Ada felt entirely authentic to her. Her eventual recognition of the deception was a kind of delayed grief for an identity she had inhabited fully before discovering it was stolen. Theory 70. The C-virus's ability to create human duplicates with authentic memory transfer was the most significant single advance in bioweapon technology between Wesker's death and Resident Evil 6. It represented something the T-virus never achieved, the ability to produce an operationally functional intelligence duplicate, rather than simply an enhanced physical one. Theory 71. The events of Resident Evil Outbreak, which depicted civilian survivors navigating the Raccoon City collapse, were monitored more closely by Umbrella than any of the protagonist-focused scenarios. Trained operators generate predictable data. Civilians generate the kind of chaotic, unpredictable survival behavior that is actually more useful for modeling real-world deployment scenarios. Theory 72. The police chief in Raccoon City, Brian Irons, had evidence of multiple other government officials in multiple cities who were on Umbrella's payroll. He never released it because it was leverage. When the city collapsed, that leverage died with him, and the people he could have implicated walked free. Theory 73. The BSAA was structured from the beginning with a funding mechanism that made it dependent on ongoing bioterrorism for operational continuity. An organization that only exists when bioterrorism is occurring has an institutional interest in bioterrorism continuing to occur. Theory 74. Ethan Winters' career as a systems engineer before the Dolby incident gave him cognitive patterns optimized for troubleshooting complex systems under pressure. Those same cognitive patterns made him unusually effective at navigating the systems within systems problem solving that survival in the Baker estate in the village required. Theory 75. The Baker house in Louisiana was not where Evelyn chose to settle after the shipwreck. It was where the mold network directed her, because the geological profile of the Louisiana bayou provided conditions optimal for fungal expansion. Theory 76. Jack Baker retained more cognitive function under Evelyn's influence than any other member of the Baker family because his pre-infection baseline stubbornness was strong enough that the mold had to work harder to suppress it. The same quality that made him an effective patriarch made him a more resistant host. Theory 77. Lucas Baker's willingness to work with the Connections was not entirely a betrayal of his family. He may have believed that surviving to work against Evelyn from inside was ultimately more useful than refusing and losing what little agency the serum gave him. Theory 78. Zoe Baker's survival after Resident Evil 7 leaves her carrying a mold exposure history that makes her biologically unusual. Her future story has never been told, but the extended mold infection followed by treatment creates a biological profile that researchers would want to study. Theory 79. The final form of William Birkin in Resident Evil 2 was not just a mutated monster. It was the G-virus's own biological imperative expressing itself through whatever substrate was available. The virus was, in its final expression, reaching towards something the franchise does not name, but which the imagery of its forms consistently suggests, a kind of distributed biological architecture that views individual organism boundaries as obstacles rather than structures. Theory 80. The sewer beneath Raccoon City was not just infrastructure. Umbrella had used it as a secondary research pathway for years, running contaminated materials through the system and observing what the ecological exposure produced in the underground biological communities. The outbreak above accelerated what was already a slow-motion experiment below. Theory 81, the Resident Evil 4, village population that was not infected by Las Plagas, those who fled or were absent when Sadler's distribution occurred, were tracked by Illuminato's operatives and eventually infected anyway. Sadler did not build a religious movement. He built a biological one, and biological movements do not tolerate uninfected individuals within their operational territory. Theory 82. Osmond Sadler's interest in Ashley Graham was not simply about her value as leverage against the U.S. government. Ashley was the daughter of the U.S. president, which meant her biology potentially carried the specific genetic markers that Sadler had identified as compatible with dominant Plaga integration. He may have intended her as a long-term Plaga carrier in a position of political influence rather than simply a hostage. Theory 83. The Ganados in Resident Evil 4, who retained more intelligence and independent behavior, the Illuminados monks, the militia commanders, were not simply higher-grade infections. They were people who had a pre-existing philosophical alignment with Sadler's ideology that made their integration with a dominant Plaga proceed more smoothly. The parasite and the host's beliefs were not in conflict, which produced a cleaner integration. Theory 84. Leon's encounter with the Las Plagas parasite during RRA4 left biological markers in his system that the BSAA has been monitoring since his post-mission examination. He does not know this. The residual trace is too small to produce effects, but large enough to register as an anomaly in standard screenings. Theory 85. Ada Wong's decision to give Leon a fake Plaga sample in ERE4 instead of the real one was not simply self-interest or multi-party playing. She had independently assessed that Wesker's plans for the dominant Plaga were dangerous enough at a global scale that preventing his acquisition of it was worth burning her relationship with him. She made a strategic decision about which threat was more serious. Theory 86. The merchant in Resident Evil 4 has met every protagonist in the franchise at some point. The encounters never made it into the games because they would break the fourth wall more dramatically than his existence already does. Theory 87. Resident Evil Revelations 1 introduced an organization called Il Veltro, whose bioterrorism attack on Terra Grigia used a marine T-Abyss variant that had been developed in the ocean depths for years. The deep ocean was chosen not for secrecy, but because conditions at extreme depth produce viral adaptations that cannot be achieved in standard laboratory environments. The ocean is the most complete containment environment available, and Umbrella's successor organizations used it accordingly. Theory 88. The BSAA's use of bioweapon-enhanced soldiers discovered in Resident Evil Village was not a recent policy change. It was a practice that had been slowly expanding for years, each escalation small enough to seem incremental until the aggregate effect was visible. The individual decisions that led there were each defensible in isolation. Theory 89. Albert Wesker may have genuinely cared about his son Jake Muller, in the same way he understood the concept of caring without being capable of fully feeling it. His decision to not acknowledge Jake's existence was not simply carelessness. It may have been protection. Someone who knew who Jake's father was and what genetic assets Jake carried would have made Jake a target long before he was capable of defending himself. Theory 90. The G-Virus's original intended application was not military. Birkin wanted to use it to create a genuinely evolving organism that could adapt to any environment, any threat, any biological challenge. His vision for it was closer to an evolutionary engine than a weapon. Spencer and Umbrella's insistence on military application corrupted a research vision that Birkin held as genuinely scientific ambition. Theory 91. The Resident Evil universe's timeline suggests that every 10 to 15 years, a bioweapon incident of approximately Raccoon City scale occurs somewhere in the world. Most of them are contained before becoming publicly visible. The franchise depicts the ones that could not be hidden. Theory 92. The progenitor virus's millions-of-year age means it almost certainly infected non-human species long before it encountered Homo sapiens. The creatures produced by those early infections may still exist in isolated ecological niches. The documented megafauna encounters in the franchise's remote environments may not all be BOWs. Some may be ancient natural infections. Theory 93. The herbs scattered throughout Resident Evil environments are not randomly distributed. They grow preferentially in areas of high bioweapon exposure because the viral compounds alter the soil chemistry in ways that the plant species documented as healing herbs are specifically evolved to process. The herbs are, essentially, natural organisms that have spent millions of years developing the capacity to process exactly the kind of compounds the franchise deploys as bioweapons. Theory 94. Spencer's Spencer Foundation, the charitable and educational front through which he conducted the early phases of Project W, is still operational. its connections to elite educational institutions remain active. No one has formally connected it to Umbrella Corporation in the post-trial period because the legal proceedings deliberately avoided examining Spencer's pre-Umbrella financial activities. Theory 95. The music heard in the original Spencer mansion was not selected casually. Spencer had specific architectural and aesthetic preferences that were designed to produce particular psychological states in people moving through the space. The mansion was not just a laboratory. It was a designed environment intended to disorient, isolate, and stress the people inside it, producing optimal conditions for assessing their performance under pressure. Theory 96. Nikolai Zinoviev, the antagonist monitor from Resident Evil 3, whose fate is left ambiguous, survived the Raccoon City destruction and sold the data he collected to multiple bioweapon-interested parties simultaneously. The bidding war that data generated funded a decade of subsequent bioweapon development by organizations that would not have had the seed capital to begin their programs otherwise. Theory 97. The viral research into consciousness transfer that both Spencer and Miranda pursued independently and from completely different angles, Spencer through Project W's mind transfer backup plan, and Miranda through the Megamice CT, represents the same underlying ambition expressed through different methodologies. Both wanted to transcend biological mortality. Both chose routes that required harvesting other people's bodies as the mechanism. The ethical failure was not the ambition. It was the willingness to treat other lives as raw material for the project. Theory 98. Resident Evil's recurring typewriter save mechanic has an in-universe justification that the franchise has never stated explicitly, but which follows from what we know about Umbrella's monitoring operations. Every Umbrella research facility had documentation systems. Every location where protagonist-level individuals found themselves in crisis was a location Umbrella had previously instrumentalized for research purposes. The typewriters were pre-existing documentation equipment in locations that had been, at some point, research sites. The ribbon is a limited resource because these are old machines that no one has been restocking. Save points exist where typewriters exist because typewriters exist where Umbrella used to document things. Theory 99. The remake of Resident Evil 4 introduced new lore elements that quietly contradicted several fan theories about the merchant while opening new ones. The decision to have him use plural pronouns while simultaneously making him appear far more human and far less Ganado-aligned suggests Capcom is positioning him for a larger role in future games, where his nature will be addressed directly. Theory 100. Rose Winters will be the protagonist of a future mainline entry, and that entry will be about her choosing what to do with the Megamycete fragment the BSAA holds, the choice being presented as the mirror image of Miranda's choice in 1919. One woman who touched the ancient fungus and let grief drive every subsequent decision. One girl who grew from it and has to decide whether to do the same. Theory 101. The franchise's consistent return to the theme of parents and children, Spencer and the Wesker candidates, Miranda and Eva, Ethan and Rose, Birkin and Sherry, Jack Baker and his family, is not coincidental thematic pattern. It is structural argument. The worst things in the Resident Evil universe happen when adults decide that what they want for their children justifies doing monstrous things to other people's children. The horror is always, at some level, inherited. Theory 102, Hunk's nickname, Mr. Death, is not because he causes death. It is because he survives it. Everyone around him dies. He walks out. The name is not a celebration of lethality. It is a recognition of something about him that is, if you spend enough time with the franchise's biological themes, genuinely unsettling. Perhaps he should not survive every time. Perhaps something in his biology, something quiet and unnoticed by Umbrella's routine testing, makes him not quite as mortal as the people around him. Theory 103. The destruction of Raccoon City did not end the T-virus. The rats that initially spread it through the water supply were a population that extended well beyond the city limits. The rats in the surrounding Arklay forest were already exhibiting unusual behavior before the human outbreak began. Containment of the city did not mean containment of the infection vector that had already propagated into a regional rodent population. Theory 104. James Marcus's resurrection through Queen Leech biology in Resident Evil 0 was not the first time the Leech colony had tried to reconstitute him. Between 1988, when he was shot, and 1998 when he emerged fully reconstituted, the colony was practicing. The earlier attempts were imperfect. They produced something functionally alive but not coherently Marcus. The 1998 manifestation was the 10th or 15th iteration, not the first. Theory 105. The Ashford twins, Alfred and Alexia, were among the most genuinely tragic figures in the franchise's history, precisely because their tragedy had nothing to do with bioweapons and everything to do with two brilliant children who were raised in complete isolation with each other as the only social relationship available, and no guidance from adults who actually cared about their well-being as people, rather than as carriers of genetic potential. Theory 106. Jill Valentine's extended period under Wesker's control in the gap between Resident Evil 5's prologue and its main events produced changes in her psychology and physiology that she has never fully disclosed to any official medical or psychological evaluation. She has managed these changes quietly and alone because the alternative is being classified as compromised and losing operational status. Theory 107. The events of Resident Evil Infinite Darkness, the animated series, documented a mid-level bioterrorism incident that was successfully contained from public knowledge. The number of similar contained incidents in the franchise's timeline that have never been documented in any game or supplementary material would, if compiled, suggest that bioterrorism in this universe is a near-continuous background condition rather than a series of discrete crises. Theory 108. The Plaga parasites in Resident Evil 4 were not the first instance of biological mind control in the franchise's timeline. Earlier Umbrella experiments with neural-invasive viral strains in their European facilities produced similar effects, but in less geographically contained populations. The evidence of those earlier experiments was destroyed along with the facilities. The Las Plagas discovery gave Sadler a more elegant tool for an ambition that predated his awareness of it. Theory 109. Blue Umbrella's private military structure was designed to be privatizable, and therefore to exist outside treaty frameworks that govern state military operations. When governments want bioweapon operations conducted that they cannot officially authorize, Blue Umbrella provides operational capacity that is deniable because it is technically a corporate actor rather than a state one. Theory 110. Sherry Birkin's immunity to most viral strains, derived from her G-virus survival, may make her one of the most important individuals in the franchise for the eventual deployment of Elpis as a universal antiviral. If Elpis requires a specific biological carrier to be administered safely, someone with cross-viral immunity might be the only person capable of deploying it without being harmed by the delivery mechanism. Theory 111. The unnamed woman who is Jake Muller's mother and Wesker's former partner was almost certainly deliberately chosen by Wesker as a genetic pairing. Wesker was a eugenicist by training and temperament. He did not form relationships accidentally. His relationship with this woman produced Jake, whose unique blood type and viral immunity inherited from Wesker's genetics suggests the pairing was not random. Whether the woman knew, this is not documented. Theory 112. Resident Evil's recurring motif of protagonists finding diaries and personal logs from people who did not survive the disaster they are navigating is not just narrative economy for exposition delivery. It is a sustained argument about what gets preserved and what gets lost. The files the players find represent people who continued to document their experience, even as that experience became lethal. The act of writing was, for these people, a way of insisting that what they experienced mattered enough to record, and it did. The protagonists read what they wrote. The players read what the protagonists found. The dead communicate forward through their documentation across the entire structure of the franchise, across every game, persistently. Theory 113. Something in the Megamycetes' archived consciousness is aware of Rose in a way that goes beyond simple pattern recognition. The organism that consumed her father, her parents' biological material, the neural patterns of Ethan Winters, has a specific relationship with the being who was assembled from those patterns in biological form. The Megamycete may be drawn to Rose in the same way the archive is drawn to Expand, as something continuous with itself that has moved outside the network and which the network wants. Not to consume, but to reconnect with. Theory 114. The franchise's title, Biohazard in Japan, and Resident Evil in the English release, reflects two genuinely different thematic emphases that coexist within every game: Biohazard names the threat. Resident Evil names what produces it. The evil is not the virus. The evil is always resident in the human institutions, decisions, and ambitions that created the biological conditions for the threat to emerge. Theory 115. Oswell Spencer and Mother Miranda never actually stopped corresponding after Spencer left her village in the mid-1950s. The letters recovered from her laboratory confirm decades of continued contact. The question the franchise never fully answers is what they talked about in those letters. Both were pursuing the same fundamental goal through different methods. Both were watching the other's approach with professional interest. Their correspondence may contain the most complete single record of the entire century-long chain of events that connects the Spanish flu pandemic to Rosemary Winters. Theory 116. Ada Wong in Resident Evil 6 was the narrative focal point of the most complicated single-story structure in the franchise's history, intersecting with 3 other simultaneous storylines across multiple countries. The organizational complexity required to run an operation of that scope, with that level of intelligence penetration across that many simultaneous theaters, is not consistent with a single corporate employer. Ada at that point was almost certainly operating for an entity with state-level intelligence resources. Theory 117. The Spencer family line, which Oswell Spencer used as his personal identity framework, even as he betrayed everything a family should represent, may extend beyond Oswell himself. The franchise has never explored whether Spencer had biological descendants of his own, outside Project W. Given his age and the time periods involved, a legitimate family line is possible. What someone carrying Spencer's genetics without his specific history might have become is a question the franchise has left entirely unasked. Theory 118. Chris Redfield's increasing physical bulk between Resident Evil 5 and the games that follow, it is explained in-universe as intensive training. The fan theory is simpler and more unsettling. Chris has been exposed to enough biological compounds across his career that the cumulative effect has enhanced his baseline physical capabilities well beyond what training alone could produce. He is not on steroids. He is on a decade of accidental bioweapon microdosing that his immune system has processed into something that looks like extreme fitness. Theory 119. The franchise's consistent use of Eastern European settings in its later entries, Village, Revelations, portions of Resident Evil 6, reflects something structurally real about post-Cold War Eastern Europe as a space where corporate and government oversight collapsed in ways that made it ideal for exactly the kind of long-running, unauthorized research the franchise documents. The historical and political conditions that created Miranda's isolation were not unique to her situation. The geography enabled the secrecy. Theory 120. The Duke's shop inventory is not random. It is specifically tailored to what the person he is selling to actually needs for the specific threats they are about to face. He knows what is ahead. He stocks accordingly. This is either precognitive ability derived from megamycete connection or extraordinarily detailed advanced intelligence about every encounter in the village and surrounding environment. Neither explanation is simple. Both are consistent with what the character demonstrates across the entirety of the village. Theory 121. Donna Beneviento's mansion was one of the most psychologically sophisticated constructed environments in the entire franchise, and it was built not by Donna herself, but by Miranda, who understood that an effective prison for Beneviento's psychology required the conditions that would keep her engaged, isolated, and functionally contained. The dolls, the pollen, the hallucinogenic architecture, these were Miranda's design, shaped around Donna's specific vulnerabilities. Beneviento was the warden of her own captivity. Theory 122. The leeches that constitute James Marcus's reconstituted form in Resident Evil 0 operated on a distributed consciousness model decades before the megamycete research revealed this as a viable biological architecture. Marcus's leech colony was an accidental proof of concept for distributed awareness that neither Birkin nor Spencer ever formally recognized as significant for future research directions. Theory 123. Every vaccine or antiviral developed within the Resident Evil universe has been systematically suppressed, stolen, or destroyed by one or more interested parties before it could reach general deployment. Not through conspiracy theory logic, but through the straightforward corporate and governmental dynamics the franchise depicts. A universal vaccine for T-virus derivatives is worth less to power structures that benefit from controlled bioweapon capability than the continued absence of one. Theory 124. The island facility in Resident Evil 4 was Sadler's real research center, and the village was the testing population for what he intended to deploy globally. The Americans who would have been infected through Ashley after her return to Washington were the intended first wave of a controlled political infiltration. Sadler was not building a cult. He was building a distributed political control mechanism, one influential infected person at a time. Theory 125. Alexia Ashford went into voluntary suspended animation in 1983, knowing the T. Veronica strain was not ready, not because she lacked the patience to wait for it to stabilize, but because she had calculated that a 15-year incubation period was required for the virus to reach the integration threshold she needed. She was not retreating, she was working. Theory 126. The children in Raccoon City's orphanage who appear in Resident Evil 2 and are never fully accounted for in terms of survival or fate represent one of the franchise's most uncomfortable, unresolved narrative threads. Sherry Birkin was among them. The story she escaped is told in her arc. The story the children who did not escape carries the same weight. Theory 127. Wesker's interest in obtaining the T. Veronica strain from Alexia Ashford was not simply about collecting viral assets. He believed T. Veronica represented the most elegant solution to the intelligence preservation problem that had defeated the standard T virus. Alexia had achieved genuine cognitive enhancement through T. Veronica integration. She was proof that it was possible. He needed that proof in biological sample form to understand what the mechanism actually was. Theory 128. The Resident Evil franchise has been building toward a single narrative endpoint for 30 years. And that endpoint is the deployment of Elpis as a universal cure that simultaneously ends the bioweapon era and raises the question of what humanity looks like in a world where that lever no longer exists as a power mechanism. Every story in the franchise is a chapter in the argument that gets made when that ending arrives. Theory 129. Piers Nivans, Chris's partner in Resident Evil 6, who sacrificed himself to allow Chris to escape, was infected with the C virus during the climactic battle in ways that were more complete than either of them recognized in the moment. His sacrifice prevented his body from completing the transformation in a way that would have threatened the survivors. But the completeness of his C virus integration, documented in the cutscenes showing his mutation progress, suggests he carried something in his final moments that the franchise has never revisited. What his fully integrated C virus biology would have been, under other circumstances, remains one of the unanswered questions of the Wesker-era storyline. Theory 130. The relationship between Chris Redfield and his sister Claire is the longest-running emotional constant in the franchise, and every time Chris has been at his most morally questionable, Claire has been absent from the narrative. His decision to shoot who he thought was Mia at the beginning of Village happened without Claire's knowledge. His involvement in decisions about Rose's upbringing happened outside Claire's awareness. The theory is that Claire functions, within Chris's moral psychology, as the check on his willingness to make expedient decisions about other people's lives. Without her present, he makes those decisions more easily. Theory 131. The Japanese title, Biohazard, was almost certainly chosen by Capcom with awareness that it described not just the in-game threat, but the development environment. Creating a horror franchise about biological contamination requires the team making it to spend extended time with imagery and narrative content that is, in itself, a kind of cognitive biohazard. The original development team at Capcom in the mid-1990s built one of the most psychologically impactful horror games in the medium's history, while working in conditions they described as intensely stressful and consuming. What they created consumed aspects of them in the process of being made. Theory 132. The true protagonist of the entire franchise, across all games and all timelines, is the idea of accountability. Every antagonist fails because they cannot be held accountable to anyone whose judgment they respect. Spencer had no checks, Wesker had none, Miranda had none. The protagonists who stop them are all people who have been held accountable, who have failed and recovered, who understand the experience of consequence. The virus does not make you a monster. The immunity to consequence does. Theory 133. Somewhere in the BSAA archives, there exists a complete documented timeline of every known bioweapon incident from the Raccoon City outbreak to the present. Compiled from survivor testimony, intercepted communications, and recovered research materials. This document contains the names of every government official, every corporate executive, every intelligence operative who enabled what happened. It is classified at a level that means effectively no one with the authority to act on it has the clearance to see it, and everyone with the clearance to see it has the institutional incentives not to act on it. Theory 134. The megamycete's destruction in the village incident was not as complete as the BSAA's detonation was designed to ensure. The underground network extended far beyond the blast radius. The central mass was destroyed. The archival record of every consciousness the organism had consumed over millennia was obliterated. But the smaller deposits of mold in distant parts of the network survived, carrying fragments of the larger whole, in the way that a severed mycorrhizal network's surviving nodes carry chemical memory of the lost connections. Somewhere in the mountains, disconnected from the center but still alive, the megamycete persists, smaller, without the consciousness archive it once held, but present, growing slowly in the dark the way it has always grown. Theory 135. All of this, every outbreak, every experiment, every decision that turned grieving people into monsters and ambitious people into architects of mass death, all of it traces back to a virus that was here before humanity, waiting in a flower in a remote mountain range that a civilization we destroyed once understood as sacred. The Nendipaya did not worship the progenitor virus because they were primitive. They recognized it for what it was, ancient beyond reckoning, indifferent to human categories of good and evil, powerful enough to end species that were not careful with it. They built their lives around respecting that power rather than extracting it. We did not listen to what they were saying. We took the flower. We dismantled the culture that had kept it safe. We brought it into laboratories and called it progress, and watched a city burn, and called it containment, and watched another city transform, and called it data, and let a little girl become a bioweapon, and called it research, and let a father die twice in the dark, and called it acceptable losses. And somewhere in the mountains, in the quiet dark below the frost line, something old is still growing, not angry, not vengeful, not human enough for any of that, just alive, just patient, just waiting for the next person who is curious enough to reach down and touch it. That is 135. Every one of them. Some confirmed, some speculative, some the kind of observation that lives between the two in the space where the franchise refuses to commit to an answer because the question is the point. If you made it here, all the way through from the Ndpiya highlands to the mountains still growing in the dark, thank you for staying with me. Drop a like if any of these theories changed how you see the franchise. Subscribe if you want more of this kind of slow deep dive into game lore that rewards patience. And leave a comment with the theory that unsettled you most. I read every single one. Sleep well, the lights are back on. The dark is just the dark, for now.